Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched Lupin Part 2. Let's talk about it. So Lupin is a French Netflix series that was created by George K, and this series completely blew up earlier this year. It became an unexpected hit for the platform. The series gained a lot of traction on Netflix, being featured on the top 10 list for weeks even after its premiere, and even American audiences that are traditionally less susceptible, okay, less willing to check out foreign language projects, okay, well, even American audiences fell in love with this series. So I was so excited to see the part 2 of this season, and I am so happy to say that even after all of the hype from earlier this year, part 2 definitely lived up to it. I love this show. I often tell you guys when I'm sitting here to review something that Netflix has given birth to for this week that I'm either gonna be smiling I'm either going to be full of joy, or I'm going to be sitting here with a frown, with a look of disgust and confusion. But I'm happy to say that on this occasion, of course, I have a massive smile on my face because I like to acknowledge excellence. That's simply what I try to do, is acknowledge excellence. And when Netflix gives me subpar, mediocre, or even just awful, terrible stuff, I'm sitting here with a frown. But I'm happy to say that that's not the case today, because this second half of the series definitely lived up to the hype that was built after the first half earlier this year. So we're going to be going through my thoughts on Lupin Part 2 as well as the series overall. But before we dive into all of that, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Without further ado, let's get into this. So first of all, it won't come as a surprise to you that I'm a huge fan of this series if you already watched my review of Zero, which was a Netflix series straight out of Italy that came out a few months ago, I believe, at this point. And in that review, I discussed how, one of the side effects of Netflix having to, branch out and create their own content, their own original content, as opposed to only licensing content from other studios, because they could no longer do that because studios were, of course, pursuing their own streaming services. Well, one of the side effects of all of that was that they had to reach into international markets and start collaborating with television and movie industries in those international markets. One, because again, to quench that thirst for original content, but two, of course, because they were diving into international markets, they had to make sure that they had content on the platform that would attract those markets. And so what better way to kind of design content around those international markets but by reaching out to those local industries and creating content that is designed specifically for them. And actually, in the case of, I believe, the European Union, it is actually a requirement for Netflix to reach out to these local markets and local industries in order to employ local professionals in that industry. I believe it's just to promote, local movie and film industries in order to make sure that these conglomerates are actually including them as part of their business models. It makes sense that these local governments want to boost their film industries if Netflix is reaching out to try and grab more of that market share. So I do think that that is a positive side effect, and the fact that Netflix is an international platform to begin with means that no matter where you are, you can gain access to content from all around the world, and in some cases that content can really blow up. And that's something that we saw in the case of Lupin, which is incredibly exciting. And it's even more exciting when you consider the fact that Lupin is actually a series that is led by a black actor. Now, this is a huge deal. I go into this in my review of Zero as well, but having a black lead in a European TV show is a massive, massive deal, because even though the representation discourse has been happening for a while now in America, which still leads in terms of, you know, industry standards. In the case of the UK, in the case of other parts of Europe, that hasn't really been as much of a priority. There hasn't really been as much of an emphasis on that discourse in these parts, and that is largely because of the different history and the different demographics that exist in Europe. But still, that's not to say that, you know, Black and POC people in Europe are completely invisible or non-existent. They are there. They are there and prevalent, but they are largely ignored in media. And to see that start to change, especially through, again, platforms like Netflix and what they're doing over there, is really exciting. And to see that really catch on into the public consciousness to the point where this series would become so popular is even more so. And honestly, it couldn't have happened to a better actor, because honestly, I think that one of the things that really drives this series forward, let's face it, it's Omar Sy. It's Omar Sy. Omar Sy is incredibly talented. The guy has charisma for days, charisma for months and years. Like, he has an electric presence on screen. You can't help but see the charm in him. You can't help but fall for his tricks and lies. Like, honestly, in the case of this, you know, Black lead portraying the legendary Lupin, who is, you know, a character in French literature, he's this charming thief, you know, the world's greatest thief, kind of like a criminal version of Sherlock Holmes, basically. And in the case of modern day France, you know, we could analyze, you know, what it would mean to have a Black man in this position in real life, and how likely it is that people wouldn't immediately assume immediately make certain assumptions, shall we say. Okay, we could go down that route. However, because Omar Sy is so magnetic and so charming in this role, it kind of helps you believe that people would fall for his tricks and lies and look past him at every turn. Like, you believe it, because even though in this real world, like, seeing a Black man who looks very much like the Black man who's like the most wanted man in France at the moment, even though we know in reality he would be one of the first suspects, no matter what wig, no matter what fake beard, no matter what orange jumpsuit he's wearing, but because of his charm, because of the way that he's able to use that charm in order to kind of protect himself, conceal himself when he's in disguise, or in other cases where he's able to just blend into the background, be this unassuming Black man in this kind of service capacity, whether it be, you know, a janitor that everyone overlooks. Like, he's able to manipulate society's perception of a man like him to his advantage. I just think it's believable. Like, it actually makes sense in the context of the story that he could get away with it. And even though in real life you're thinking, hang on, he wouldn't be able to get away with that and that and that, because of the world that is set up and because of the character of Assign in this context, I do think it makes it more believable, and I do think that that is driven largely by the magnetism that Omar has in this role. But on top of Omar Sy really rising to the occasion when it comes to the little gimmicks, when it comes to the shticks, the scams that Assign gets up to throughout this series, I also think that he's able to sell the more emotional elements of the story, his relationship with his son, as well as his relationship with his ex-partner, and exploring their history through flashbacks, I think was really endearing and really interesting. And, you know, sometimes when you're in the thick of it, when you're in the thick of the mystery or the scam that's unraveling before your eyes and they go to a flashback, it can be a little bit frustrating, because I personally felt like I preferred staying in that moment in order to explore the latest scheme that Assign had whipped up. But at the same time, I did enjoy the fact that they kind of tied in those flashbacks and the themes that are explored in those flashbacks with the current situation. So it wasn't like a random flashback that popped up. It's something that very much tied into the overall story in that moment. So I feel like it kind of lessened the blow when we were being distracted, diverted from the main mystery or scam that was playing out. But again, I do think that those flashbacks are helped by the fact that we believe the relationships that Assign has with his son, as well as with Claire, and also with Juliet, and, you know, everyone that's involved in the story. We'll talk about the whole story in a second. But yeah, I do feel like tying in those those flashbacks to the present day is enhanced by the fact that we believe the relationships that Hassan has with the people around him that he cares about. And also, to the other actors' credit, I do think that their performances also enhance this. I mean, we have the character of Raul, who becomes incredibly important, especially in the latter half of part 1 and the first half of part 2. But that whole storyline where Raul gets kidnapped by one of Pellegrini's kind of lackeys, one of his assassins that he has on payroll, that's a really interesting kind of dramatic storyline that may have felt a little bit cheap and cheesy had it not been for the genuine chemistry and father-son and relationship that we see on screen that is portrayed by the two actors. And I think that the actor who portrays Raul does a really good job in that, because oftentimes his kind of character would be seen as quite annoying, ungrateful, you know, that sort of thing. But the relationship that he has with his father, the admiration that he has with his father, and also the fact that his father tries to introduce him to something that he feels so passionate about, something that's always been so close to him, and that is of course the stories of Lupin, and the fact that he's so receptive to that and holds that dear to his heart, I think really helps when it comes to building up that tension and building up the drama with the whole kidnapping storyline. Automatically you just become more invested, and I appreciate the fact that the series actually made us like the character of Raul instead of just relying on the fact that he's obviously the main character's son, so you have to feel for him when he gets kidnapped. In the case of Claire, it's tough, okay, because technically speaking, Claire's not wrong. Hassan has done some messed up stuff, okay, he's kind of ruined her life in a lot of ways, like if we're really being honest, but it's tough because we like him so much that we're always going to be against Claire, even when she's speaking sense, like even when she's completely right, we're like, Claire, stop harshing our vibe, okay, like we love Hassan, like we love Lupin. And so yeah, it can be tough with a kind of character like that. It's kind of like a thankless role really, but if we're considering, you know, this kind of archetypical female character, I would say it could have been worse. Like it could have been worse if we're gonna give her credit for anything. I did also want to mention the special relationship, the special friendship that exists between Hassan and his bestie Benjamin. Oh my god. They are so adorable. I love them both so much, especially in part 2 where we see Benjamin play more of an active role in Hassan's schemes. I loved that. I love the fact that he knows Hassan so well from childhood, and again we have those flashbacks kind of supplementing that information about their friendship. But I love the fact that he knows Hassan so well. I love the fact that he backs him, even though there are moments where he's like, you know, like for example when Claire's moving on with that new guy, he's like, yeah, the new guy seemed pretty good but not as good as you. Yeah, he's just such a cool guy. Like I love them as friends. And then of course at the end of the series we do get a third assailant, okay, we do get a third guy joining the gang. I can't remember his name right now, but they actually meet him in the library when they're having their stakeout, trying to figure out who can join them on their mission. And I'm telling you, I had no idea. I'm telling you, it took me way too long to figure out that that guy that they met in the library was the guy who had been employed by Pellegrini. It took me way too long to realize that they were the same person, because hair and makeup had done their job. Hair, makeup and costuming had done their job. When they meet that guy in the library, he looks completely different. His whole look is giving me scene/emo early 2010s. It was completely different. And then they have that scene, that montage where he's getting a haircut. They're removing his makeup, they're removing his nail varnish and kind of creating this whole new persona for him. And still, it wasn't until the very last moment where I was like, oh my god, they had a man on the inside. It took me way too long to figure it out. But yeah, that whole trio at the end, love them. Love them. Like they all have great chemistry together. They all made for a really interesting, energetic team. And yeah, I was very invested in their whole mission because of their personalities and team dynamics. Okay, so now that we've talked about the main players, let's talk about the story itself, because I think that the story, the way that the series is written, is quite impressive. And even though it's not perfect, even though there are plot holes, holes, some inconsistencies in logic, okay? I do think overall I was so impressed by the way that they laid out this story, these mysteries, whilst also having these really fun and creative and honestly very clever schemes and scams that Lupin can actually engage in. So first of all, the main story is that we have the character of Oozing, and his father, Babacar Diop, used to work for the Pellegrini family. Now, he was their kind of chauffeur, their kind of housekeeper. He was working a very service role, and he was often dismissed by Pellegrini. It's a classic case of racism. Where they overlooked him. They saw him as the help. They didn't really consider him with much respect and value. But then Pellegrini decided to take it one step further with his racism, okay, because the underhanded comments already weren't enough, okay, the looks and the dismissal wasn't enough. Instead, he had to take it one step further and accuse Babacar of stealing a necklace. And not just any necklace, but a necklace that belonged to Marie Antoinette that was worth millions upon millions of euros. So then you have the situation where Babacar is actually arrested and imprisoned, and he is pressured into admitting that he is guilty falsely because he didn't actually steal that necklace, and then he ends up being assassinated. And it is just so heartbreaking to see this man who all he wanted to do was work hard to give his son a better life. I mean, this is a story that is so relatable to so many immigrants in the world and immigrant parents in the world, but especially if we're looking at the context of France and seeing this man who comes from a francophone African country. He's come to France to start a life for himself and for his son, only for him to end up in prison for a crime that he didn't commit because it was pinned on him by Pellegrini so that he can claim the insurance money. And not only that, but then several years later, the necklace magically reappeared only for him to sell it for millions more because of the mystique, because of the narrative that surrounded it, which increased its value. Wow. In so many ways, it's a very simple story to kind of have this whole series be about, but at the same time, it is quite complex because there are so many real world social issues that are used here as wider context to really deepen the story, to really create more layers in it, like the fact that Babacar is this immigrant from Senegal, I believe. I'm not sure which country he's from, but again, if you know the history of France, if you know the history of its colonialism and also its current situation with immigrants there, it just adds layers to that story. And again, if you know me, if you know my channel, you know that I live for that stuff. And that is the beauty of this story as well, is the fact that in a lot of ways, of course, it feels like it's very fantastical, it's very exaggerative and not realistic, but at the same time, a lot of it is also rooted in reality. There are also racial elements to this that are very applicable to modern day French society, and I really appreciate the fact that this is exploring that. And again, it was very reminiscent of what we saw in Italy's Zero. Now, earlier in this review, I did mention how Lupin is definitely giving us, you know, some Sherlock Holmes vibes, except this time around he's a criminal. And I do think that one hallmark of a good Sherlock Holmes story is being able to follow the logic, being able to follow the steps that Sherlock Holmes takes when he's, you know, investigating a murder or, you know, whatever case he's working on. And this very much reminds me of what I said in my review of Enola Holmes last year, where one of the issues with how they tackled Enola Holmes's, you know, mystery solving is that you couldn't really follow the steps along with her. There were a lot of conveniences, there were a lot of things that kind of popped out of nowhere. You weren't able to partake in the detectiving. You were kind of left in the dark about a lot of things. But in the case of Lupin, it does a very good job of going back and showing us what his steps actually were and creating these very clever scams. Like, I genuinely think they are so clever. Yes, there are elements of them that heavily rely on fantasy, but at the same time, I do think overall, to be able to write such an incredibly engaging incredibly fascinating and clever scam for each episode, I think is a talent. I do think that the writers did an incredible job in that respect with this series. I will say though, if there was one element of the series that did kind of frustrate me, not that it was bad, but it was just like frustrating, it was infuriating, okay? It would be the police storyline. Okay, I know that we need to have the police involved, kind of trying to decode Lupin and his mischief and his schemes and scams. I know that we need to have them there in the story somewhere, but man, were they annoying. Man, were they annoying for like the majority of the show, because it felt like they were like many steps behind in a lot of ways. And even that one police officer who loved Lupin's stories as well and was able to detect the similarities in a lot of the adventures that are written in the books, even with him it was getting a little annoying, especially after the whole kidnapping situation later in part 2 of the series, where he turned out to be quite useless. He turned out to be quite useless because the thing is about the police in this series, and perhaps even in real life, is that they make this big deal about, you know, following the rules, and, you know, Lupin is a criminal, he's done this, this and this, but then they get the chance to like arrest a man who's done way worse things that was like right under their nose, and they fumble the bag. They fumble the bag each time. Like, even in the case of Pellegrini, I wouldn't be surprised if in part 3 he gets away with everything, or he gets a lesser sentence or whatever, because he's a privileged white male. Like, of course he's going to get away with murder, literal murder. So that's the frustrating thing about the police, is that if at least I felt like their investigation was going to be fruitful, and like Pellegrini and his other accomplices were actually going to face substantial consequences for their actions, maybe it would feel worth it. And it certainly doesn't help that early on in the series, of course, it's revealed that the police captain is in Pellegrini's pocket to begin with, so it's just frustrating. And lastly, I did want to mention that I did in fact watch this series in French, in its original language, because I am a French speaker. I'm a French speaker, okay? C'était pas problème pour moi, j'ai compris ce qu'il disait, donc oui, j'ai regardé en français, so I had no problem following the storyline in French. I did have English subtitles on because I have subtitles on for everything nowadays, but yeah, I very much enjoyed being able to see their performances in the original language that it was intended to be seen in. But I'm interested to hear you guys' thoughts. Maybe you guys watched it dubbed with English or maybe another language. Did it kind of feel the same, or did it feel off to you? Let me know down in the comments below. But yeah, overall, I'm just a really huge fan of this series. I think it's one of the best, most refreshing things to come out of 2021, especially from Netflix, who we know I have a love-hate relationship with. But yeah, I'm very impressed that they were managed to stick the landing, especially after the hype that was built up from the first part of the show. And I'm even happier to say that I think the second half of the season even blew the first half out of the water. I think it was just excellent, especially when it came to the mysteries and the scams that were being done in the second half. I think it just felt smoother, like Lupin had just become this well-oiled machine who was out on a mission to get justice for his father. And so with all of that being said, I'm going to be giving Lupin an 8 out of 10. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on Lupin, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this series down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!